Well, it's really great to be here today, and I want to just talk about a whole lot of different things. I'm going to talk some about autism, talk some about animal behavior, talk some about different kinds of thinking. And first of all, I think I might just start out and just talk a little bit about what exactly is autism. It's a neurological disorder that the child is born with, and it varies from very, very severe all the way up to geniuses up in Silicon Valley. Maybe a little bit of the trait. You've got somebody who's going to do the next big tech startup, and at the other end of the spectrum, you've got somebody that remains nonverbal, that's very handicapped. It's a continuum of traits. And you might wonder, how did autism help me in my work with animals? Understand animals, you got to get away from language. I'm a visual thinker. The mind works like Google for images. I used to think everybody thought that way. And one of the things I hope I get you to think about today is different ways of thinking, different ways of approaching problems. And an animal's world is totally sensory-based. They're going to store memories as a picture, as a little audio file, as a touch sensation, as a smell. Just imagine how much information the dog gets off the local tree. He knows who's been there, when they were there, are they friend or foe, what is their rank in the social hierarchy. There's lots of information on the local tree, but it's sensory-based. Well, how do you know that? Well, the only way the brain can store information, if you don't have verbal language, is sensory-based. And even ants can store pictures in their brain. There's actually a paper in Science about that called Multiple Stored Views, where ants use pictures to find their way back home. Now, language has a tendency to kind of cover up the kind of sensory-based thinking. This is Van Gogh's Starry Night. And you can see how you got these eddies up in the sky. Well, some mathematicians decided they'd analyze those eddies, and they fit a statistical model of turbulence. I don't think Van Gogh knows anything about mathematics or turbulence. He just thought they were pretty. And that brings up, pattern thinking. Going to discuss that a little bit later. There's a certain type of Alzheimer's, whereas the frontal cortex gets destroyed, art ability comes out in somebody with no previous interest in art. This is the work by Bruce Miller, and that picture there, the beautiful horse picture, was drawn by a patient with Alzheimer's. And then eventually, the disease wrecks everything. See, the brain is sort of like a big office tower. You see, I have to think in pictures in order to think about things. Imagine a great big office tower. Up at the top of the office tower, you got the chief executive officer. That's the frontal cortex. Then you've got the division vice presidents. That's language. And then underneath that, you got the fun geek stuff. Visual thinking, music, math, all that good stuff. And you kind of get rid of some of the frontal cortex stuff, then the techies down below, they can really get out and play for a while. And then eventually the entire building gets wrecked. Now the thing that is different about thinking in autism and regular thinking is it's details. This really helped me in my work with cattle. It's also bottom-up thinking. You piece lots of little details together to form a whole. And this is a test to determine whether a person's a detail thinker or the Gestalt thinker. You got great big letters there, like a great big S made out of little S's, or you can have a great big S there made out of little H's. And one of these letters will be flashed up on the screen, and they'll say, well, press the key, to identify the big letter or the little letters. I, like a lot of people on the autism spectrum, I picked up the little letters much more quickly. I attended to the details rather than the whole. But details are important in this world. If a bridge engineer didn't pay attention to details, maybe the bridge might fall down if he made the welds too small. Okay, there's some research now that shows that the normal brain tends to ignore details. And the way this study was done, it was done by Dr. Nancy Minshew at the University of Pittsburgh, is they put people in a brain scanner and had them read out of a book. And the autistic person gets the details of the words. The Asperger's that's kind of very mild autism. They get both the whole, the syntax, and the details of the words, and the normal brain drops out the details of the words. Because one of the big problems I have when I'm working on animal behavior troubleshooting, or I'm working on troubleshooting with people with autism, people are too vague. They'll say, well, my horse goes nuts, or the kid has behavior issues in the classroom. Well, what's a behavior issue in the classroom? Throwing spitballs, I might have to handle that a lot more differently than I would handle a problem with maybe being aggressive in the classroom. Very important. Okay, some of the very first work that I started out working with animals was to figure out why cattle didn't want to go through certain chutes. And I went around to a whole bunch of feed yards in Arizona, and in some feed yards the animals went through easily, in another feed yard they wouldn't, they might be blinded by the sun. This particular place, the animals didn't want to pass this flag. This particular place is ready to tear down the whole facility, and all they had to do was just move the flag. Why was the flag their distraction? It's rapid contrast, and it's high, and it's rapid movement. It's high contrast. You know what? You're going to have to stop. This is driving me crazy. This brings up another problem that I have in autism. Is one of the problems is attention shifting slowness. I find it very, very difficult to block out all the flashes. Like the TV cameras don't bother me because they just sit there and they don't move and they don't do things. And I think we're going to have to stop the picture taking here. I'm sorry. And I was going to talk just a little bit later on about some of the sensory problems. Okay, look at how that animal is looking at that sunbeam. You know, that seems really obvious. And on a cloudy day, you're not going to have that sunbeam. But when I first started out, you know, people thought it was crazy that I actually started looking at things that cattle were looking at. And I found if you remove distractions, like a chain hanging down in a chute, a coat on a fence, maybe get rid of reflections, then they'd move right through the system. You got to get right down in the chutes and see what the animals are seeing. This is some of the first work that I ever did. And when I started out in the 70s, I was a total pioneer. The movie shows very nicely how, you know, women weren't allowed in the feed yards. You know, there was a lot of male chauvinist piggery in those days. And nobody in those days was really working hard on cattle handling, except for one scientist from South Africa. And I went to his seminars, and there was another scientist in New Zealand, Ron Kilgore, and he was looked at too like he was a nut. He was doing some of the same things I was doing with sheep back in the early 70s, getting down and seeing what they're seeing. Look at all the shadows that you get on a really bright, sunny day. Cloudy day, you don't have the shadows. You can see people through the side of the chute. They either need to back off or you need to put up a solid side. You know, thinking about what cattle were seeing, nobody had even thought that that was important before. Also, you've got to watch things like ear radar. The movie did a beautiful job of showing which way the horse's ears are going. Look at how the zebra and the horse have an ear on each other, and the other ear is on me. You know, you've got to watch details. Animals will tell you things. How do you know if an animal's starting to get scared? You see the whites of their eyes, they're getting scared. The horses and cattle are switching their tail. Switching the tail, that's happy in a dog. That's not happy in horses and cattle. Okay, what is visual thinking really like? And I have found that, you know, people just out there range a lot in how much visual thinking they have. And if you're on the extreme end of the visual thinking spectrum, it's like having movies inside your head. This is a picture a young autistic man sent to me to show how he literally has movies in his head. My mind works like Google for images. And I used to think everybody thought in pictures. I didn't realize that other people think in different ways. And I realized my thinking was different when I was writing my book, Thinking in Pictures, that was published in the mid-90s. And I asked people, think about a church steeple, how do they come into your mind? That was the question. And I was really shocked to find out that most people got this generalized, vague church steeple. I only see specific ones. Now, if I ask you, think about a house or a car, you immediately see your own house or car. But I wanted to ask you something that nobody usually owns one, but you see them every day, and the visual thinker will just start naming off where the churches are located. Or if I ask you about a boat, they'll start naming off the boats that they know. It's specific. This brings up a really important concept. It's specific to general thinking. I form concepts by taking specific examples, put them in a category. So you have a whole lot of specific examples of what a church steeple is. or maybe what a house is. It's all specific. It's bottom-up thinking rather than top-down. And I'm going to show you how they flash into my mind. The movie did an absolutely fantastic job of showing how pictures flash into my mind. Okay, childhood one, local ones, famous ones, they come up just about like that. Sort of like going through Google for images, and I can go back through them. And the pictures that tend to come up first are early memories from childhood or something I saw just last week. And now, of course, for the church steeples in Fort Collins, I have all the weird ones. There's a weird round one with wood shingles on it. There's an ugly cinder block square one that has green louvers on it. I call that one Our Lady of the Louvers. It's over in LaPorte, Colorado. It's specific. Now, if I say cell phone tower, I see another set of pictures, like a fake tree, a really stupid fake tree, or a fake silo. And I put the cell phone stuff in there. But the problem is, if I ask you about cell phone towers, a lot of people may not know what they look like. I've got to ask you something you know what it looks like. So it just flashes up in my mind, and then you can get off the subject. Okay, let's say the last one right there. Okay, if I hold that up in my mind, then I might start thinking about my trip to London. This is how it's associative. Then it gets off the subject. Now I start getting pictures of, we went and we looked at the crown jewels. Oh, they were really pretty. I looked at them, I go, are those really real? Now I'm in the diamond category, and I'm seeing the ad for De Beers, and it says a diamond is forever. That makes me think about something I tell my students about email. I said, emails are like diamonds. They are forever. So if you write really bad stuff on the internet, it can be forever. You see, okay, how did I get from church steeples to London to diamonds to email? Okay, now you see there's a logic to that thinking. It's associative, it's not linear. Now, visual thinking really helped me in my work designing cattle handling facilities, because when I drew a drawing, I could test run the equipment in my mind. Now, I had to go through quite a long learning process, and this brings up the important thing of you have to develop abilities. And when I was a little kid, my parents developed my ability in art. My ability in art was encouraged. Girls in the 50s learned sewing. I had a toy sewing machine, and then later on in 6th grade I got a real one. I loved sewing. It was making things. And I was really good at artwork and good at making things. I was very good at embroidery, too. In fact, that helped to get me into the Swift plant. There's a scene in the movie where I meet the wife of the manager. Actually, it was the wife of the insurance agent. There was a slight change here, and she liked a hand-embroidered shirt. I was wearing my portfolio. And what I learned is I had to sell my work and not myself. But we take these young, quirky kids, might be good at one thing, bad at something else. We need to build up their area of strength. And we need to be thinking a lot more about what are they going to do when they grow up. Now, I have found that visual thinking is a continuum, that most designer friends I have that are in the meat industry, when they look at a blueprint for the whole plant layout, they can visualize the equipment still but not running. I'm very getting concerned about people getting away from doing hands-on things. Because one of the things I saw as the industry went from hand drafting to computer drafting, the old people, when they went over to the computers, their drawings are fine. But when the young people just came in and they'd never built anything with their hands and they'd never drawn a drawing by hand, they're making a lot of weird mistakes on drawings. Like they don't know where the center of the circle is. There's an aerial view of the dip vat that was recreated for the movie. The geek side of me just loves the fact that all my projects were actually built and they actually worked. Like they built the gate exactly the way I built it, dip vat, the squeezing machine, and the optical illusion room. And I spent a lot of time building that optical illusion room. And it made me kind of happy to find out that the stagehands had a hard time building that even though they had the drawings for it. That kind of made me happy. And there's one of my drawings. Now the thing is, I got to emphasize that it takes time to develop skills. You know, I could build things, I was very good at building things, but I did have to go through a learning process of figuring out how the lines on a drawing relate to the real object. And what really helped me is I got this great big blueprint for the whole Swift plant. It included the water tower, the parking lots, the roads, everything. And I walked around the plant until every line on that drawing could relate to a real thing. Like a circle was a water tower. A little tiny square on the drawing was a concrete column and it held the roof up. Everything on that drawing. And then I was able to build things on the drawing. You know, you've got to train ability. I didn't learn cattle handling stuff overnight. I spent 3 years training myself how to lay things out and do the design work. And there's the dip vat. And also what made me happy is that this drawing right here actually was on the conference table in the movie. It was used as a prop. That was my real drawing, and they animated the cattle going on that. And you might wonder, why round? Well, cattle like to go back to where they came from. Want to use that behavior. There's the dip vat. And this just shows a basic curve facility. And in my design class, my livestock handling class, I have students design a cattle handling facility. Now, I got a lot of students today that are probably going to be a pet veterinarian or some other field that might not even go into livestock. And they say, well, why do I have to design a cattle handling facility? I said, okay, for people that may become, a small animal practitioner when they grow up, think of this as a visual problem-solving task. You've got to figure out how to do this. There are different ways to lay it out that are right, and there's ways to lay it out that were wrong. And yesterday in class, I took the 20 best drawings and I laid them out, and they could see that there were different ways to solve the problem. Because I'm concerned today about problem-solving skills. You know, kids aren't doing hands-on things. They've taken hands-on classes out of their schools. I think it's a problem. And I have to teach my students how to relate the lines on this drawing to the actual real thing. So in class, I actually switch these back and forth in class, kind of like this. So they can look at the drawing and then look at the thing. And then I have them take this drawing and walk around down at our RDAC experiment station and relate the lines on the drawing to the real thing. There's the real thing. Here are some of the common mistakes I've seen in young people that have come into the industry, and they're doing computer-aided drafting, and they've never used their hands to build things or draw. Radius point of the circle's not in the center of the circle, 25-foot long gates in a pig stockyard, uneven alley widths, gates that don't swing right because they don't use the compass function. I have had students in my class that didn't even know what a compass was for drawing circles. I had one girl that said, well, Dr. Grandin, I can only draw one size of circle, and she pulled out a Boy Scout compass. She didn't know about, I guess they don't do compasses and protractors anymore in school. I think that's a shame. Now, some little kids on the autism spectrum, also some kids with some other labels, oftentimes something like drawing skills will show up young. We got to build on that. A lot of these kids will get fixated on a certain subject, like airplanes or trains. If he likes trains, read a book with trains. Let's do mathematics involving a train. Use the motivation or the fixation. One of the places where autism may have helped me when I was getting kicked out of all those feed yards was that drive. Also, I didn't pick up the subtle sounds. As long as the cowboys didn't actually kick me out of the feed yard and I could get to work with the cattle, then I was happy. Now, I used to joke around that I had a huge internet trunk line in my brain. This is a brain scan taken right through here. This is what's called tensor imaging. And what this maps are big cables that are in the brain. See, in your brain you have gray matter, that's what you think with. And then you have white matter, that's the inter-office communications in the brain. And yeah, I've got a huge, big internet trunk line. See how far back that goes in the back of the head? That's going all the way back into what's called primary visual cortex. That's where the graphics files are. And the control has a smaller one. And here's another slice that's taken right up here. And I've got a huge one there on the right-hand side. But the thing is, not everybody with autism has this big trunk line, because not everybody on the autism spectrum is a visual thinker. The thing is, they're uneven thinkers. You have uneven skills, good at one thing, bad at something else. And here is another kind of thinking, is a pattern thinking mind. I think in photorealistic visual images, like photographs on Google, and they come up sequentially, like Google lays them all out on the screen. No, for me, they come up sequentially. And the pattern thinking mind, this is the mathematics mind. This is a more abstract kind of visual thinker. And this praying mantis is made out of a single sheet of folded paper. No scotch tape, no cuts. And what you see in the background, that's the folding pattern for making the praying mantis. This isn't my mind. And these are the guys that are going to be really good at programming and engineering. Now this is an important slide, because I have found when you get kids that have problems, and don't get too hung up on these diagnostic labels, because right now they're thinking of taking the Asperger's label out, which is Asperger's is just mild autism, making it all autism. Now they've got another awful category, temper dysregulation disorder. And then they also have got another one, oppositional defiant disorder. I have a hard time with that being a medical disorder. Thank you very much. My training in neuroscience, and I've got a lot of training in neuroscience, I'm more of a hardcore biologist. There are certain things in the brain like anxiety, you can get obsessive compulsive, depression, schizophrenia, the autism, the lack of social interaction, but all this other stuff, once you get away from maybe 5 or 6 various brain systems, I think gets into the BS department, if you want my opinion of it. And what I have found is that certain people like me that are photorealistic visual thinkers. We can't do algebra. Absolutely can't do algebra. But I'm finding people that where algebra was failed, but they could do geometry and trig. And they need to jump to geometry and trig. Also, some of the pattern thinkers have this same problem. Daniel Tammet, he wrote a book called Born on a Blue Day. If you want to understand pattern thinkers, that'd be a great book to read. Oftentimes they have trouble with reading comprehension. English writing, doing really good English writing, or any language writing. These are your music and math minds, the pattern thinkers. And then another kind of specialist mind, they're verbal thinker. These are the guys that can tell you every fact about the weather. These are the guys that might make really good journalists. They make a great tour guide because they can just talk about their favorite thing over and over and over again. And then I had a student that was dyslexic, and she was an auditory thinker because she had a visual processing problem that made it just impossible for her to draw. And she did animal behavior by listening to how animals sound, their breathing, how they walk, it's the sound of them walking, and not it drawing. Okay, now what you might be wondering here is, how do I form a concept? How do I understand a concept when everything is a bunch of pictures floating around in my mind? I got to sort the pictures into categories. This is a picture I got from the same little book called Little Rain Man, and he's sorting cats and dogs into boxes in the brain. It's actually neuroscience research that shows that you can put, the brain makes file folders. For example, on the leash and off the leash, a dog will treat that as 2 separate things. The rider on the horse, I get scared, people on the ground is fine. Different file folders, different pictures. And so when I was a little kid, I sorted the animals by size. And then when a neighbor's got a dachshund, I had to figure out why Rosie the dachshund was not a cat. And I finally figured out that all dogs, no matter how teeny-weeny, have the same nose. On the leash, off the leash. You see, it's a different picture. Oh, sorry about that. Sorry, there's something in here that's making me allergic. I'm really, really sorry about that. I hope that didn't deafen everybody. That's the kind of sound that when I was a kid, that would have just sent me into a screaming tantrum. Loud, sudden sounds like that hurt my ears like a dentist drill hitting a nerve. Man on the horse, man on the ground. Cattle view that as 2 different things. Cattle that are used to being moved on a horse, they may have a flight zone of this big. Get the person on the ground, they're running away and scattering, unless they're trained to both. You see, it's a different picture. Animal thinking is much more specific. If you want to teach a young autistic child the concept of not running across the street, you got to teach them in a whole lot of different places. You got to teach them at home, teach them at the library, teach them at school, teach them at the Smith's house, a whole lot of places. Then you'll start to get the concept. Otherwise, you'll think that the rule only applies for at home. And again, both animals and a lot of people on the spectrum, it's bottom-up thinking. You take specific examples, put them together to make concepts. You want to teach a child number concepts? Let's count bottle caps. Let's count pencils. Let's count coffee cups. Let's count toy dinosaurs. You maybe use 10 different things. Then they know that the counting concept applies to many different things. Now, a lot of people think autistic learning is just like being a tape recorder and sort of like just rote memorization. And when I was in high school, kids used to tease me. They called me tape recorder. I could never figure out why they called me tape recorder. And they called me tape recorder because I would always say the same things. But if you get these kids out and expose them to a lot of new things, then you fill up the internet. See, the thing is, imagine sort of an internet in the head, and you got to fill it up so the Google inside the head has got stuff to serve. And some of the mild kids on the autism spectrum, they're geeks and nerds, like Sheldon in Big Bang Theory. And Sheldon got an Emmy, and when he did his acceptance speech, he was just Sheldon. He was just playing who he really is. Well, he gets up there, and just really geeky, he goes, and he blurts out 25 names of people to thank. Okay, teaching concepts by specific example, like kites up in the air. You walk up the stairs. You walk up a hill. You go up in the attic. These are all examples of up. Teach that concept. Same thing with math. Count a variety of different things. Now here's a horse that's scared to death of black cowboy hats. And he's scared of black cowboy hats because when something very bad was done to him, he was looking right at a black cowboy hat. White cowboy hats are good, black cowboy hats are bad. They often will associate something bad with something they saw or heard right at the moment the bad thing happened. Like a dog might get afraid of the place where he got hit by a car. Well, a person wouldn't do that. A person's got more association cortex and would know that the car did it, not the mailbox he was looking at the moment he got hit. Let's get back to the different kinds of minds. And when I was asked to do this talk, I was asked to give a longer version talk I did for the TED conference out in California. It has a lot of technical people. I got to meet the heads of Google. I got to meet all kinds of really neat people. And I got to meet a lot of geeky, kind of nerdy people that went down the right track. And what worries me, now I just gave a talk in Missouri, is a lot of these quirky, geeky kids are getting addicted to video games and they're not going anywhere. And when they're out in California, they just go right into airplane design, or they go into a tech startup. Those are the lucky ones. And we got to figure out how different minds can work together. Because I have found with my own students, I had a student one time, she was good at everything I was bad at. She knew how to keep records really neatly, keep all the data straight, run all the SAS programs. But what I was good at was thinking up the experiments. So we made a really good team. We need, different kinds of minds, and they work together, can really do good things. We want to think about different kinds of minds. We need to be thinking about what a lot of these quirky kids are going to do for a job. I'm seeing too many kids graduate from high school and they don't have any job skills. When I was 13 years old, mother had me working for seamstress. When I was in high school, I took care of 9 horses. I was building things. When I was in college, I did an internship at a research lab. We've got to start teaching these kids work skills. Where are all the mildly autistic people my age today? Most of us are employed. Starting out with paper routes, when we were kids. And I'm seeing too many of these kids kind of going down a rut they shouldn't be going down. We've got to work on helping these students to be successful, build up their strengths. And when it comes to the video game playing, let's limit it to an hour a day. You see, there are some kids that could go in to be a video game programmer. Not me, I can't do the math. If video games had been around in the 60s, I would have been a video game addict, and I wouldn't have gone anywhere, because I don't have the right skills for making video games. One of the people who really helped me was my science teacher. He's beautifully shown in the movie. I was so happy that David Strathern won Emmy, and Julia Ormond got one for playing Mother. Those were 2 people that really helped me. But a mentor, you got a teenager that's kind of, adrift. That's where a good teacher can turn a kid around, especially a teacher in one of the specialist areas. This is what worries me about, taking out music classes, art classes, shop, welding, sewing, cooking classes. Things where a teacher in one of those specialist things get a kid turned around. I'm worried that we don't have enough science teachers. I gave a talk one time at a great big school district, 700 teachers in this big auditorium, high school teachers. I asked how many science teachers were in there. There was only 2. We've got to get kids into these hands-on things. It's a shame, I've already talked some about this, getting ahead of my slides a little bit. They've taken out a lot of the hands-on classes. We got to give, this was a slide from the TED conference, different kinds of minds and opportunity. Hire them, mentor them. That happens out around in the areas where they're the right kind of industry. But one time I was out in Kansas and I had one mother say to me, well, there's nothing interesting in Kansas. I go, yes, there is. There's feed yards. Where do you think the door to opportunity for me was? There's all kinds of interesting stuff in Kansas. One time I went to a little podunk airport and I went into the hangar and they were restoring the coolest old antique airplane. You know, there's a lot of retired engineers, retired artists, retired musicians that might really like to mentor a kid. You know, we need to be finding those people. Well, art class is my salvation. Those are some pictures from my childhood. You know, the only places where I was not teased was during riding and during things like Model Rocket Club. Other places like the cafeteria, it was just constant teasing. And I did have friends. And I had friends through shared interests. You know, like riding horses, doing art projects together. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about sensory processing problems. And a lot of people have them. And every year in my class, I always find some students that have this problem. They absolutely cannot draw. They just draw squiggly lines. They can't draw circles and things. And sensory processing problems really mess up your academic career. And the thing is, a lot of them are treatable. And a lot of different labels have these things. Again, don't get hung up on these diagnostic labels. I go to an autism meeting. I see a teenage boy. Yeah, a little Sheldon Jr. headed down the rut. I go out to the TED conference and I meet certain people out there who shall remain nameless, dressed up just like Sheldon, and they're running some of the most important corporations on the planet. And they didn't get a label. Okay, when I was a little kid, loud sounds hurt my ears. Oh, when the school bell went off, it hurt. High-pitched, intermittent sounds, the worst. Another thing I already talked about, attention shifting slowness, like with those cameras over there flashing. I just couldn't shut that out. Too distracting. Okay, if it was flashing in the back, that wouldn't bother me. Right up here where I can see it, it just really bothers me. Brains that have a problem take a longer time to shift back and forth. I absolutely cannot multitask. Well, I don't think normal people can multitask that well either. And another thing I'm doing now in my livestock handling class is I have the students do an internet project where I want them to look up journal articles on animal behavior on a narrow subject. I want to make them dig deep, deep, deep. They got to learn to go way past the first page of hits. Now, there's some people, when they go to read, the print will jiggle on the page. And my dyslexic student had this problem. Boy, it really ruined her for reading. And sometimes you can fix that by wearing colored glasses. That sounds really crazy, but if she hadn't had these colored glasses, she would have flunked out of school. There's something wrong in the brain. There's circuits here in the brain that assemble the graphics file. Shape, color, and motion circuits are back here in the brain. And you know, vision scientists do not know how they work. They know they're there, but they don't know how they work, how the graphics file is actually formed. But something's wrong with that. And the shape, color, and motion stuff's not working right. And for some strange reason, you put on maybe some pink or some purple glasses, this stopped shaking. And if my student hadn't done that, she would have flunked out of school. And these are things, a lot of these sensory kinds of problems, scientists need to be doing a lot more studying on this. You know, the core deficit in autism is you're not that social. And I always have people asking me all this social stuff. I'd rather talk about geek stuff. I was with a news crew yesterday. They wanted to talk about all this social stuff and political stuff, and I wanted to talk about the fact that they had repaved this road twice in the last 10 years. Now, it certainly wasn't built very well to start with. That's something that I find a lot more interesting, is the fact that why do we have to redo one of the runways at the Denver airport and it's not even 10 years old yet? Something was wrong with how they built it. I find that kind of stuff interesting. Well, there are some of my books. And what I want to do right now, just for a few people up here in the front, I'm going to take some questions off a few people that can just speak out to me, and I will repeat the question. You know, I can only go like just a few rows back, but okay, how about here in the black and white checkered shirt right there? Oh, my mother's doing just fine. She's 83 years old. She came to the Emmys, and we got up there on the stage, and I just had this urge, and I just had to go over and get the mic, and I had to say, Mother, stand up, stand up, stand up. And she stood up in front of 13 million viewers. It was really great having her there. I was allowed to have one guest, and I made sure it was my mother. And we had a really, really good time out at the Emmys. She's doing fine. She's doing some talks too. One of her big concerns is the problem we've got with autism is if you have a kid on the real mild end of the spectrum, that kid can go out and do Silicon Valley stuff, go out and do really good stuff. Maybe just be really good working in agriculture, working with animals. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have a child that's nonverbal. He may be destroying a house. He may be so sound sensitive that you can't go to a restaurant, you can't do normal things. If you brought him in here, he'd be screaming the whole time. That makes it very, very difficult for the family. This is the problem. It's a very, very broad spectrum. One end of the spectrum, you might have a little bit of an advantage. Another part of the spectrum, you've got horrendous big problems. Okay, right there. All right, there's two questions I got here. Do I take the squeeze machine when I'm traveling? No, I don't. In fact, I've gotten where I can hug real people now, but deep pressure is very calming to the nervous system. Deep pressure over wide areas of the body. I got the idea for the squeeze machine from cattle squeeze chute. That's shown very nicely in the movie. And when I first watched cattle go in the cattle squeeze chute, all they were doing was giving them a vaccination. They weren't doing anything, painful to them. And I noticed some of the animals just kind of lay down. So of course I wanted to go try out the cattle squeeze chute. And then I built one. And there's a lot of simple ways to do pressure with little kids. Getting in net swings, getting under gym mats, weighted vests. And the thing is, autism is very variable. So maybe doing deep pressure works for one kid, it won't work for another kid. This is one of the problems we have with autism. The sensory issues you have in autism are real variable. What do I think about the whole mercury thing? And I always get asked about the increase in autism. I think the geeks and the nerds, the mild Asperger's, the guys that aren't very social or really geeky, they've always been here. The Sheldons, I can think of kids I went to school with that were like Sheldon. And he's got a good career. That Emmy's going to help him get other jobs and keep the show going. And I like seeing him getting that Emmy because he's one of us. You go back, play his little acceptance speech and you'll see. He's playing himself. He was just the nerd in a tuxedo. Well, I think that show's just a blast. I love Sheldon. And, those people have always been here. But I think there's some very severe autism that has increased. You can get a kind of autism where the kid seems to be, he may have some problems, he's getting some language, and then they lose it. There's a very definite regression. And there's all the controversy about vaccines and things. I think one of the things that has to be done to shut that book permanently is we've got to study the regressive subgroup separately. And when I bring that up to the experts, they just get very silent. The thing is, when you're dealing with a disorder that's very, very, very variable, you can get a subgroup within that may be responding. And this is the way it is with a lot of some of the therapies. Like, one person on the spectrum, those colored glasses work. Maybe 10% of the time. They really work for that 10%. For the other 90%, they don't work. Okay, we're going to right there.
Many years ago, you came up with ideas for revolutionizing the cattle industry. Do you think that everyone has kind of gotten that message now, or are there a lot of plants that still need changes?
All right, let's talk about things in the cattle industry. What I found in the cattle industry, even back in the 70s, selling the equipment was easy. Oh, they'd build a new dip vat, then tear it up and wreck it. Well, in the 80s, that was a terrible phase for the industry. The plants really went to wreck, and they just speeded everything up and sloppy, and things got really bad. There were always a few places that did things right. I always had my good clients. That's what kept me going. And there were a lot of other people, put in a nice center track restrainer system and tear it up and destroy it. I don't want to go into what they would do to the cattle. And the thing that really changed it, in other words, forced the management side. So you've got equipment, that's half the equation. In the early 70s, I thought I could do it all with equipment. People thought if they put internet in all the schools, it would make the schools wonderful. No, you've got to have good teaching. Internet's nice to have in the schools, but good teaching is more important. Well, nice equipment's nice to have, and you have to have at least adequate equipment. Then in the early 90s, things started to change. There was the Jack-in-the-Box E. coli disaster, and McDonald's moved in and started inspecting meat plants for food safety. Boy, this was early 90s. You really started to see change. Then some of the activist groups, stirred up the pot a bit. So now McDonald's had to look at animal welfare. And I took vice president level executives out on their first trips farms and slaughterhouses. And when things went well, they were happy. And when things went bad, they were very upset. And the thing that was interesting was to watch this issue going from being an abstraction that you just give to the legal department, give it to PR and make it go away, now became something real. There were things that needed to be corrected. I remember the day when an executive saw a half-dead dairy cow head for their product. He was really, really, really upset about this. So then my job was to train these food safety auditors who were already out there to do the welfare audit. I saw more change in 1999 when we did that than I've seen in my whole career, because now the plants had to manage the handling. Couldn't just let the back end of the plant turn into a circus that just wasn't supervised. And there were a lot of plants with older equipment. And I'm happy to say, because one of the things I had to do was I had very bad conflict of interest. Here I am, an equipment designer, enforcing now these new rules. And so I go in the older plants, I had to figure out how to make them work without doing fancy, new, expensive things. And I found in most of the plants, I could fix them with non-slip flooring. So we had lots of non-slip flooring, unloading ramps, stun boxes, lots of stuff with lights. I'd add a light to light up a dark chute, because they don't like going into the dark. I would move a light to get rid of reflections. I'd put up cardboard to block seeing some people up ahead, and then I'd have them replace that with metal. And I could fix most of the older plants. We had 3 plants out of 75 that had to build really expensive stuff. The others we fixed with a lot of inexpensive things. Yes, now the nice equipment is easier. It's a lot easier having the fancy equipment than having older equipment. But we could make the older equipment work. I also developed a very, very, very simple scoring system where we counted what percentage of animals did you shoot right on the first shot? How many were mooing and bellowing during handling? That's a really good measure of handling problems. How many fell down? How many did you put the electric prod on? Simple things I could measure that were like speed limits. It worked absolutely great. So in the beginning, I was strictly, I'm going to say, a hardware engineer. And then, lately, I've been working more on what I call software engineering. And I mean software as in soft inside of here. We've got to start changing attitudes. And there were a few plant managers that had to be fired. There were 3 out of the 75. Nothing was going to change. And I think I'm getting a signal here that we need to be ending. And I just want to thank you all for coming.